So, good evening, everyone. This is the inaugural session of ICHRRF Fellowship Training Program. And this inaugural session, we are very pleased to have our distinguished Chairperson of International Advisory Board, Professor Ved Nanda ji, present here, who will take the first seminar in this series. We have both our fellows present here, Mr. Ankit Shah from Ahmedabad, India, and Mr. Ripudaman Pachori, who is based in St. Louis, Missouri. So before I start the seminar, I would invite Professor Pathak to say a few words, and then we will start the seminar. Professor Pathak.
Thank you very much, Professor Adityanjee. My humble pranams to all of you, and especially Professor Nanda, who is online with us. It is a great honor to have him here. There is a very nice saying which says that only when we live a value, it becomes our virtue. And Professor Nanda lived all his life with humility and compassion for all, irrespective of caste, creed, race, and nationality. And all his life he dedicated for professional as well as the legal expertise and everything for the human rights and religious freedom around the world. In spite of all his towering achievements in his professional career as a world-renowned international law expert, and it is one of the unique personality Professor Ved Nanda has, because there are very few centers which have been installed in the name of a person, and Professor Nanda has a center established by the University of Denver in his honor. And he has been a strong proponent of human rights and religious freedom all his life. He not only fought for human rights, but also made sure the victims are appropriately rewarded. He did that by sitting on many such tribulations. One of the tribulations was on Philippines, and then he was sitting on the tribulation in Singapore, and then he made sure that the Filipinos who suffered because of the President Marcos there, he made sure that most of the victims received the rewards out of that funds. And in spite of getting Padma Bhushan and several honorary doctorates from many universities, traveled over 100 countries, he never forgot his values, humility, and compassion for all. I am associated with Professor Nanda, and I always consider him to be my mentor. And I have seen him in action when he talks to his 400 students sitting in the classroom with over 100 books spread on a large table. And then suddenly he tells, hey, here is my young friend sitting at the back, and make sure that my presence is felt. And that was a great honor. I thought myself that Professor Nanda could do that. And I remember that day because I spent all my time in his class, and I was so impressed as a professor. He was one of the most popular professor. Probably he must have been receiving the best faculty awards in University of Denver for the largest number of times. So we really here as International Commission on Human Rights and Religious Freedom, we feel honored as well as we feel really rewarded to get a permission from Professor Ved Nanda to offer a Professor Ved Nanda Fellowship in Human Rights. It is a great honor for us as ICHRRF, and we would like to um, really welcome these two young people, Mr. Ankit Shah and Mr. Ripudaman, who really, uh, I always feel that when you become the fellow in the name of Professor Ved Nanda, oh my God, it's a big tension for us as well as for you probably, because the values which he had practiced all his life becomes for us to imbibe in our life also. So uh, ICHRRF wishes to express our sincere thanks to Professor Nanda, as well as would like to welcome Mr. Ankit Shah and Mr. Ripudaman as the fellow of the Professor Ved Nanda Human Rights Fellowship. And I think we all together will be able to contribute significantly towards human rights and religious freedom around the world and make sure that we do this with humility and compassion as our role model, Professor Ved Nanda, has done for all his life. Thank you very much, Dr. Adityanjee, for this opportunity. Namaste, everyone.
Thank you, Professor Pathak, for this kind introduction to ICHRRF and to Professor Ved Nanda. We are having a little bit of technical difficulty. Professor Nanda somehow has dropped out, so we will wait for him to join. Uh, Carl, can you get in touch with Professor Nanda so he rejoins back? We have planned a series of 8 seminars over the next 2 months. And the format would be that one of our fellows will do an initial presentation for approximately 30 minutes, followed by the faculty preceptor who will discuss that further. In the last 30 minutes or whatever time is left will be Q&A, and anybody can ask questions, whether those questions are from fellows or other members of the audience. These seminars are open seminars, which means any member of ICHRRF, if they want, they can join these seminars and attend. Furthermore, we will be recording all these seminars. So whatever content is discussed in these seminars would be available as a resource educational material, not only for our current fellows, but also for our future fellows. I'm receiving a call from Professor Nanda, so let me attend.
Nanda is on again.
Yes,
Yes.
here he is. Okay, welcome again, Professor Nanda.
I, Mr. Shah, you must see how technically savvy we are.
Oh, oh
And,
no, such
you know,
glitches happen.
I listened in part to Dr. Pathak, and Dr. Pathak is gone.
No, he's still here.
Yes. If you want, I can repeat it again.
and I don't have any words now to say in response at all. So, Pathak, you were so kind, and I was afraid that during that your wonderful, eloquent presentation, I should not interrupt. But Mr. Shah, forget all that. Dr. Pathak is a very, very good friend. So all that he said, discounted. And I teach, and actually, it was the other way around. Dr. Pathak is my mentor and has been for a long period of time. So that's why he said all those nice things. But in any event, today's program, I want to welcome you heartily because this is our first fellowship and you are the first person to do that. And I looked at your credentials and I'm very, very impressed with your accomplishments.
Thank you,
Looked
sir.
at what research you are going to do, and it's a very critical and very important topic, and I'm glad that you are undertaking it.
Thank you.
Today, before you make your presentation, I thought I would say a few words about human rights movement at the present time. In the days to come, in 2 weeks, Dr. Adityanjee is going to take you through the entire movement. But I want to say a few words because I have been teaching human rights for a long time. And the amazing part is that the very first course ever taught in this, not just in this country, but in the world, was at Yale Law School. And I was privileged to be in the very first course being taught by the director of the Human Rights Division of the United Nations. There was no book, there were no materials. He would simply bring at that time the international covenants that he was working on. And at the same time, we were sitting there and talking with him, and he was working on all those treaties. And then when I began teaching in the law school, I decided that I was going to start human rights. And so in this place, practically in the middle of nowhere, we had the second international human rights law course taught anywhere in the world. So this is how human rights began. Actually, as you think about human rights, in Bharat, we have always looked at human dignity. We did not talk in terms of rights, but it's the same idea. And at the present time, there are many, many people who are very critical of the Western human rights traditions, and for good reason, because we feel that rights, along with that, duties. And when we talk dharma, it has got a different meaning. But we need to remember how human rights began. It began after the Second World War, and it began after the Holocaust and after all those atrocities by Nazis. So the recognition or realization was that human rights and international peace and security, they are very, very closely interconnected. That a country where a ruler is not taking care of human dignity, protecting people, violates human rights, that ruler is going to be and that country is going to be the one a menace to international peace and security. And that's how the human rights movement began. So, what happened in the United Nations is that at that time, the president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, President Roosevelt's wife, she was the one who was representing the United Nations at the United States at the UN. And she became the president of the very first UN Human Rights Commission. And the first thing that she did was she wanted to have an international Bill of Rights. That just as the United States has a Bill of Rights, she wanted to have in the UN for the entire international community a Bill of Rights. And very briefly, not to go into any depth, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the one that was drafted. It was drafted with people from all religions, but at the same time, it has got an imprint of Judeo Christian tradition because it was Eleanor Roosevelt, there were people from Europe, and it was Jews and Christians. But then the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, amazingly, has got all those principles, fundamental principles, that are acceptable to all religions. However, again, very briefly, the Cold War began and there was no treaty. Declaration is not binding. It is simply a United Nations resolution, and that is a standard of achievement. It's guidance, but it's not a treaty. There is no obligation. But then when those treaties came, the focus at that time simply was on states, that rulers violate human rights of people. People need to have those human rights so that rulers don't oppress them. And that is why you can see that when Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, they talk about India, they talk about the United States, they don't talk about the non state actors. They talk about the state violation of human rights. And that is where the problem lies. But in any event, I simply want to mention to you that it's a very, very robust, very potent idea. Human rights is the one as an idea that was responsible for the apartheid to go down. That's an idea that was responsible for many, many countries in Europe and Asia fighting for their independence and saying that they need self determination, they have got rights, nobody can take them away. That is how the movement, Western movement, began. After the Universal Declaration, then those treaties, both of them that I sent you, and you saw the link. I didn't want you to have to spend a whole lot of time about it, but very briefly to touch upon the religion part. At the present time, there is no treaty on religious freedom, but there is a United Nations declaration, not simply a resolution, but declaration has got its own sanctity because all countries have accepted it. It shows state practice. It shows state commitment. And so Universal Declaration of Human Rights has become now practically customary international law. And even if it's not a treaty, even if it's not binding, the principles enshrined in the Universal Declaration are being accepted by almost all countries. So that is how it all began. And then the United States is the one that, as an outlier, it did not even accept, did not ratify the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It again goes back to the Western tradition. It goes back to the British tradition, where the monarch is the one that people were fighting against. They were talking about human rights, and human rights were simply civil and political rights. That there is my body, I need freedom, I need liberty, my ruler cannot oppress me, my ruler must accept me as a human being and having a human dignity and having rights. So that's the setting in which it all began. And there are at the present time so many treaties. As I mentioned to you, women, children, torture, apartheid, you keep going, treaty after treaty, from genocide to war crimes, all those treaties are there. And we can talk about them. But at the present time, the machinery in the UN is that the United Nations has got a Human Rights Council now. And in that Human Rights Council, there are about 40 plus countries sitting there, and they meet and they talk about issues. But at the same time, what it has done is that they have started rapporteurs, they have started working groups through the Human Rights Council, and those rapporteurs have been working on issues. Now, there is a rapporteur on the freedom of religion. And there is, along with that declaration and along with that treaty, a whole lot of work being done. The only other thing that I want to mention today to you is that there is 4 years ago an effort at the United Nations that there are victims of human rights violations based upon religion. And those victims are to be recognized. Now that we have Bangladesh and all that is happening in Bangladesh, 4 years ago, 2017, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution, and they said victims of religion-based violence, that they are to be recognized. And the Secretary General of the United Nations, on 22nd August 2021, just a few months ago, he honored and remembered the victims of acts of violence based upon religion or belief. And he said, across the world, we continue to witness a rise in hate speech, intolerance, even physical violence and attack on individuals, groups, and sites purely because of their religious beliefs or their religious thoughts and significance. So the point simply is that at this stage, on religious freedom, there is a declaration. There is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18, that I sent you. And that Article 18, I think maybe I should read that because it's the same kind of article that there are about, I counted 12 treaties. I won't name them, but there are 10, 12 treaties, the same idea that is accepted by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that is also in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And let me read to you. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And then it says this right includes to change the religion or belief. And that is where, at the present time, Christian missionaries say, well, it talks about the religion to change, but then they don't want to read further down that there is coercion and freedom from coercion. And it says that you cannot, using those temptations and coercion, try to change anybody's religion. But I simply wanted to mention that to you, that on religious freedom, because on this commission, as you joined, the commission talks about religious freedom, because human rights and religious freedom. And on freedom of thought, freedom of religion, as we move on, I might be sending you some more material. I won't be joining you for this discussion. I'll occasionally sit in, but obviously there are other issues that are going to be brought to your attention. But the basic idea of this Western human rights movement, I'm going to send you some very basic material that you might want to read. I am just now, I finished a chapter and I'll send to all the people here. This is on justiciability of economic, social, and cultural rights in the United States. United States never accepted, never ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Because here you can go back in the Western thought, and you might have seen their names, Locke and Rousseau. Locke is the one that was simply talking about liberty and contract. And so Locke is the one that did not feel about anything else but civil and political rights. And Rousseau is the one that did believe that there are positive rights that the government or the regime ought to be able to give to their people. When we talk about our own Rajas and Maharajas and good old days, and then you think about those benevolent monarchs, that is not the setting in the Western tradition. Western tradition was, let the government be off my back. That was President Reagan used to say. And the country resonated with that. But in any event, I'm going to stop here, and I would simply again reiterate for you that human rights, Western tradition, no matter how flawed, no matter how gaps, that is the game in town. And that is what we need to understand and appreciate. Because when we talk about human rights, it is in that nomenclature, it's in that language that today's discussion in the international community is going to be. I think I would like to use the term human dignity. And human dignity then becomes closer to what Hindu thought has been. But I'll stop here. I want to hear from you about your research. And then Dr. Pathak is here, Adityanjee is here, and maybe some other my colleagues are here. Carl Clemens is here. So we might ask some questions and have some conversation. But Pathakji, Adityanjee, Carl, anybody else, anything to add before our friend makes his presentation?
I think let's have Mr. Ankit Shah do his presentation, and then we can have a discussion.
Go ahead, please.
Sure, sir.
Shekharji, namaskar.
Namaste, namaste, namaste.
So, thank you, sir, for your guidance, for the initial prep that you are helping me with. Thank you, Adityanjee, Karl, Ripudaman, Shekhar, sir, and Pathak, sir, all for being present here. Looking forward to your guidance in the future. Thanking for this fellowship. I'll straight away start with my presentation for the day. Um, so I have worked out some basic thing on human rights, and I always start with the history, some of which sir has already. Can you see on screen?
Yes, we can
Is
see.
the presentation visible?
Yeah, we can see your presentation.
Yeah. So human rights, when we talk about, I've taken this from Article 2, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It belongs to all humans, regardless of race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. This is the official Article 2 of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So human rights are simply because we exist as human beings, and they are not to be like specifically granted by the state itself. That's the thought which even sir shared, that it shouldn't be that it's just about the state. It should be people to people inter se also, which is where this thought of human dignity comes into play. So they range from the most fundamental, the right to life, to those that make life worth living, such as rights to food, education, work, health, and liberty. Now, ancient India society, which was based on dharma, and the plane, is the screen visible clearly,
Yeah,
or is it hazy?
it's a little hazy.
We can't read it, but please go ahead.
Yeah. So ancient India society based on dharma, where the basic word dharma comes from the root origin of duties and not rights, whereas the Western template comes clearly from the rights-based movement. So when we talk about wars, there are example of even 1367 BC, where the Indian kings, when they were stated to have entering into agreements for the human treatment of prisoners of war, and sparing lives of enemies, unarmed subjects, and innocent civilians. The concept of Vasudeva Kutumbakam contains the spirit of human civilization, which comes from this thought process of human dignity. Even the Rig Veda, the oldest document of the Indians, declared all human beings as equal and respect the dignity of human rights. The Babylonian code of Hammurabi, it has around 282 edicts, and there are examples given over there of an accused person being considered innocent until proven guilty. So this stems from the law perspective. British Magna Carta, where it was signed by the King of England in 1215, it became a turning point in the Western template of human rights, because over here, the right of the church to be free from governmental interference was one of the perspectives they started with. The rights of all free citizens to own and inherit property and to be protected from excessive taxes. This is something which is derived from the British Magna Carta. And then we see the French Declaration of the Rights of Men. Now, over here, this comes from the France's National Constituent Assembly in 1789, a human civil rights document from the French Revolution. That's where the origin lies. And the Declaration of the Rights of Men of the Citizen has a preamble and about 17 brief articles. The first article contains the document's central statement, which says men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Now, definitely in the present terms, as we see, men is not the word. I mean, in terms of universal, when we talk about, India have taken initiative even at the United Nations to get this word replaced so that it's able to cover all the genders and things like that. It states the purpose that the political association should be the preservation of these rights, enumerated as liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. So this is something which came from the French Revolution. We also have the US Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights protects freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to keep and bear arms. Now, usage of gun laws is something which is still debated in United States, but for this particular gives the Bill of Rights talks about bearing arms too. The freedom of assembly and the freedom to petition. It also prohibits unreasonable search and seizure, cruel and unusual punishment, and compelled self-incrimination. This came into effect December 15, 1791. So essentially limiting the powers of the federal government of the United States and protecting the rights of all citizens. As Sir rightly put out, that the Western template contains the government backing, government should back off from me, right? So from that thought about the protecting the rights of all citizens, residents, and visitors in the American territory. So this is something derived from the US Bill of Rights. Now, events preceding this Universal Declaration, as Sir rightly pointed out, in the World War I, we saw trench killings, usage of poisonous gases, and new weapons affecting innocent civilians also, which was violating the human rights. The League of Nations was set in response to this emerging international need for morality. Following the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt came up with this New Deal 1933, which guaranteed social and economic benefits for workers. Now we need to know that the whole thought premises of communism came after the Industrial Revolution in Europe. So there were mass cases of exploitation of workers and laborers, which happened because of the piece of technology which came with the Industrial Revolution. This worker-based philosophy, where one economic unit could produce 1,000 times more than the Indian or a Chinese, manual laborer or a worker, right? So this Industrial Revolution has some of these causes of human rights violation that we see with the piece of technology. Here, Franklin Roosevelt also talked about the 4 freedoms in 1941, identifying the freedom of speech and religion and freedom from want and fear as essential for all people. In the World War II, we have seen the Nazis exterminate millions of people: Jews, Gypsies, communists, people with disabilities, Jehovah's Witnesses, and even homosexuals. Now, when we talk about freedom of religion, there are some religions or the religious thought coming from their doctrine, where homosexuals are particularly being targeted. I mean, there's a blanket separation between believers and non-believers. Some of a core part of the research topic which I am proposing with this fellowship. The Japanese military brutalized a lot of residents of the occupied countries, and then the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on Japan. So these are the background preceding the UDHR. The Nazi and Japanese war criminals were prosecuted in the war trials, and then came the Nuremberg Code and Tokyo tribunals. Nuremberg Code is particularly being discussed these days, specifically with respect to the corona and the vaccine reports which are coming in terms of allegations of of unfair usage of this kind of businesses. The United Nations then got established in 1945. Now, the fundamental question is, where does this human rights are derived from? Like in the nation state format, where the state is seen as subject and individual human as object who derive these rights from the state. Now, how far this thought can be explored is something that we need to see, and I would like to have a lot of deliberations from experts that we have here and further towards the fellowship. The NGOs and war victims lobbied for human rights inclusion in the purposes of the international organization after this background. Now, in 1946, we got this Commission of Human Rights formed. 1947, this drafting of declaration began. 1948, the deliberations went on, and by 12th October 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted the UDHR. If you talk about the General Assembly vote, these 48 were in favor, Brazil, China, Cuba, Ethiopia, France, India, Iran, US. 8 abstained. These were the countries: Belarus, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Ukraine, USSR, Yugoslavia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa. These 8 countries abstained from vote, and there were 2 absent: Honduras and Yemen. So this is how the General Assembly vote happened on it. Um, in terms of UN member states abstentions and points of contention, Saudi Arabia said that some of these articles contradicts their Quran, which is a religious doctrine, in terms of freedom to change religion and certain gender and marriage rights. South Africa talked about right to racial equality interfered with apartheid at that point in time, in terms of point of contention. In terms of these nations, Belarus, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Ukraine, USSR, and Yugoslavia, they opposed interference with sovereignty of nations. So these were the point of contentions which were raised at that point in time by these nations. Now, the UDHR together has 2 covenants: the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, which Sir rightly put out, agreed upon majorly in the Western principle, whereas the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, this is something which is yet to be ratified, as Sir pointed out. But these 2 in total make up the International Bill of Rights. So that is how the format is. Now, one of the concern which I would like to point out, this just came as a thought, when we are talking about human rights, and when this thought process must have started, of course, they would have had some kind of a background, as we discussed here. But several decades later, the United Nations started talking about climate change. Now, when we talk about Indian Dharma, you can talk about what is the Dharma of water. You can talk about what is the Dharma of fire. You cannot talk about what is the Dharma of water or fire. So the point I'm trying to make is, when international bodies like United Nations have to come up with climate change several years later, why not, when we are defining something on rights basis, should be to live other forms of living, extended to other forms of living too? This is something that a thought came into my mind when I was going through all this stuff. So exactly as Sir rightly pointed out, Eleanor Roosevelt, this is the picture of her, delegate to General Assembly 1945 to 52, and this is the chairman of Human Rights in the United States. These are some of the images of the past. Now, UDHR articles, there are examples like Article 5, which talks about freedom from torture. Now, we know that most of the countries, especially in terms of war spoils and terrorism, or in terms of prisoner of war, or getting espionage and those kind of assets, when they capture of other nations, an element of torture is always there if we talk about investigation or criminal investigation of these culprits whenever they are found out. So Article 5 talks about freedom from torture, whereas Article 25 talks about right to health care. Now, most of the advanced nations have these provisions made for health care for their citizens. So I don't know if the poor nations would be able to afford or not, but these are some of the articles which are expected in terms of human rights in the UDHR articles. So this is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. These are the nations, orange. They have ratified: Canada, China, France, Germany, India, Japan, Mexico, and UK. These blue ones are the ones not signed as yet. 7 countries: Belize, Kazakhstan, Laos, Liberia, Sao Tome, Principe, South Africa, and USA. And these blue ones, the Botswana, Cuba, Mozambique. So these gray ones are signed but not ratified, and these blue ones are the ones who have not even signed. So that's Botswana, Cuba, Mozambique, Myanmar, Oman, Pakistan, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. So this is with respect to this International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. As I said, there are two parts: the civil and political rights, and economic, social, and cultural rights. That's all from me for now.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And I think initially I would simply request my colleagues any comments, any questions. And after they are done, I've got several comments and several questions, but I'll go after my colleagues have done it. So, Adityanji, anybody can begin. Shekharji is going to say something.
No, I was about to say that the introduction was very nicely done, Nandaji. I really liked it. And thank you, Ankitji, for your good presentation. I really liked it. I think I'll continue to listen, but I don't have any questions.
Thank you, sir.
Let's see if Professor Pathak has any observations, comments, or
No, probably I don't have any questions. I enjoyed the presentation and I'll wait for Professor Nanda's comments.
No, but Mr. Clemens, Adityanji, anybody, any comments, any questions first, and then I'll go.
well, since everyone is shying away from, I will start. So, as I said earlier, this is the inaugural session, the first session of Human Rights Fellowship Training Program by ICHRRF. And I must say that I am very proud of our faculty, but I'm equally proud of our fellowship trainees. It tells us and it tells to everyone else that we have set a very high bar. And I would say that Mr. Ankit Shah has set up a very high bar, not only for himself, but also for his peer, Mr. Ripudaman Pachori, who is our second fellow and would be making a presentation next week with Dr. Shekhar Patel. So both of you would be alternating each week with a different faculty preceptors. You know, we have looked into some of these treaties and whether countries are adhering to it or not, whether they have signed but not ratified. So there's a lot of complexity here. And I think just because you live in an advanced country does not mean that it adheres to all the components of international, covenants and treaties or bills of rights. And even in this day and age, in 21st century, Ankit Shah mentioned freedom from torture. Sitting in this country which champions human rights, we did see waterboarding, and it was quote unquote allowed by the government of United States at that point in time by just an executive order that it does not constitute torture. So we have to be ever vigilant about the nuances of some of these aspects. Mr. Shah also talked about, rights of prisoners, rights of everyone. And there's something called right to due process. And sometimes that is not there. So there are children who were separated from their parents on the US border with Mexico. There was no right to due process. There was no recognition of right of children, who were separated, torn apart from their families and used as a bargaining chip. So just because we are based in United States, which is the most advanced country, one of the richest countries, does not mean that all the rights are being observed properly. We talk about, right to health. If you look at some of the Western social democracies, yes, they do have right to health. But the way we see right to health, again, it's patchily implemented in United States. So yes, there is progress, but we live in a society where countries can claim to be observing human rights to the maximum fullest extent, yet they are not. And these are not theocracies, these are not autocracies, these are not dictatorships. But in democracies also, they are lacunae, and sometimes by the sheer political power or power of the military or economic power, you can sort of, you know, hide things under the rug. And I think we need to pay attention to that. Those are the only comments I'll make, and I'll leave to Professor Nanda and other people.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Shah, very good presentation. You have looked into the past. A couple comments for you.
Sure.
You mentioned Magna Carta. You mentioned also the French Declaration, the US Declaration. These are obviously the most important uh, precedents that you have on human rights issues. But as you look at them, you find that you mentioned about the church and church hold, and how Magna Carta is the one who said, no longer can you do that. But it was more than simply church, it was the king. And these were the feudal lords. And they were the ones who were fighting against the king. And so, starting from there and coming to the US Declaration, and you appropriately mentioned about liberty and freedom and all that, but you did not see a single thing in all that in terms of positive rights. They are negative rights,
Yes.
they are negative limits. These are the limits that they are on the rulers. You don't take those things away from me. Don't torture me. I have got a body integrity. You can't do that. And you're absolutely right saying that the human rights are inalienable. These are rights because I'm a human. I have got human dignity. I've got human rights. Nobody can take those away from me. But at the same time, as you mentioned about the right to health, and Adityanjee talked about the right to health, there is no right to health in the United States federal government at all. There is no right to health mentioned, not a word about health, not health mentioned in the US Constitution, not food mentioned in the US Constitution, not education mentioned in the use of education, not housing mentioned in the US Constitution. And so, therefore, all the judicial pronouncements, all the cases heard in US courts, federal courts, they have simply said these are not the rights, fundamental rights, and there is absolutely no right of people to any of them federally. So today, what has happened is that in this country, there is a hodgepodge. All these rights, positive rights, are being given by states, by their local governments. Education is state, then the school districts and local cities and school districts, but not the federal government. So federal government has got now adopted by the Congress some of the laws. Today there is some legislation, but there is no federal right to education, right to food, right to health. Absolutely not. And that is the issue at the present time. There have been cases out of Detroit, cases out of Rhode Island, some of our states, and those cases are the ones that are fighting today to say that this is a right It's a fundamental right. We've got a right to education. And the federal government says no, there is no right to education. It's not in the Constitution, it's not a fundamental right. So, the difficulty in this country on that issue, and I'll talk more about it, send you some reading on it, but
Sure,
keep
sir.
that at the back of your mind.
Okay.
Similarly, what has happened is that you had mentioned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all those Russia at that time, the Soviet Union, and Soviet Union allies, all of them said no. Their no means simply they did not vote against, but they abstained.
Yeah.
And so that abstention was the one because no country voted against. All these countries simply abstained. And why did they do that? Because they felt very, very strongly at that time. You may remember, China was not in the United Nations.
Hmm.
It was
Yeah.
Taiwan that was representing China.
Hmm.
And therefore, that was one of the major reasons they talked about state sovereignty. But the issue really became of China, and Soviet Union at that time did not want to participate. That is again the reason when it did not participate on Korea issue, and the United Nations took action on Korea. And the reason simply was that Russia had walked out of that Security Council meeting because in the Security Council, Taiwan was sitting and not the Communist China who had been in power at that time. I think the only other point that I wanted to mention to you is that as you read, and because you have looked into all that, and I'm very, very pleased that as you read further and as you look at it further, kindly know that when we talk about duties, and obviously in Bharat, duties in Hindu thought, let me see, again, something happened. Yeah, I think.
We can see you, sir.
Yeah, no, I'm okay. So I think as you look at all that kind of setting, what really has happened is that in the last many, many years at the United Nations and in the international community, when they are looking at rights, it's the same coin. As you turn the coin, there are duties. And so at the present time, the only place where you've got duties in their charter is the African Convention. And the African Union is the one at the present time that has got in their own charter duties also, the concept of duties. The European Commission doesn't, Inter-American Convention doesn't, but the African Convention does do that. You had in your presentation said that you wanted to have a couple questions that you want to pursue further. Could you kindly again mention so that I can assist you?
Yeah. So this is with respect to the research topic that, with respect to this fellowship. I can share my screen.
Yeah, please. Do you want to talk about it or?
Yeah. I'll, I'll just open the screen so that. Now, this is with respect to impact of conversion on human rights. So this is with respect to a study in the light of differences between religion, dharma, and state-led de-religionization, right? So I'm talking about this Abrahamic thought process of one God and one life, which has repercussions in the routine life of believers as well as non-believers. The effect of change in religion, conversion from dharma, and de-religionization, which is, I'm also talking about the communist one, where the state de-religionizes the people, right? So this research gap is something that I wanted to address here with this research topic. So the human rights scene in the country gets impacted by the decision to impose religion or de-religionizing the people, right? And there are four chunks of categories that I've made. One which is, the fixed and codified commandments which religions have, or the state rules. Both of these result in a specific kind of a community behavior. So four categories: the believers, the non-believers, the converted believers, and the forcibly de-religionized ones by the state. These are the four categories which I want to study. So the impact on human rights of these four categories of people is what I want to study. So for this, these are the chapters which tentative chapterization which I have created. First is introduction to religion, dharma, and state-led de-religionization in the past history. Second chapter is differences between religions of the world and dharmas of India. So we have over here four which are specifically Indian origin: Jainism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Sikhism. Right? So what are the differences between this two? I mean, the word religion comes from this Western thought of Abrahamic religion, but right now my belief is that wrongly construed Indian dharmas also as religion. So my article is coming tomorrow on this in the newspaper, that religions and dharma are totally different. So one is this. Chapter 3 is about the impact of Christian conversion on Europe. So I want to cover some pockets over here, how the pagan Europe was converted and what effect that had on the human rights over there, and the impact of Islamic conversion on Iran, on the Iranian people. So these are the two specific I have selected for this particular study. And the human rights impact from contemporary perspective. There's a third chapter. So the impact of cultural revolution that happened in China under the Chinese Communist Party, which I call it as de-religionization under the communist regime. Second is impact of missionary conversion in India. I'll cover some pockets there. And the impact of community behavior of believers of religions on non-believers worldwide. So I want to cover some of these parts over here in this particular research study. So I wanted some of your thoughts on these chapters, like is it the correct direction for the study?
I'll be delighted to even give some more thought, but some initial, immediate kind of reaction to your presentation. It's a very, very good, thoughtful work that you have done. When you talk about impact on human rights, what do you mean human rights impact? For example, if um, please go ahead, explain.
Impact of religious conversion on human rights. So when we talk about someone converting from Hinduism to Islam, right? So what would be the impact on the human rights of that particular person? And in terms of the daily routine life that changes because of the religious commandments, and what impact it has on the human rights of all those who interact with that particular guy who's converted.
You're assuming that a Hindu who is being converted had really been practicing all Hindu culture, Hindu scriptures, and a practicing Hindu. Most of the Hindus, even in India, don't know anything about Hinduism. So, how does it impact any of those human rights of the person? And when you talk about human rights, you're talking about again health, education, civil and political rights. How are they impacted?
So, if you observe in a Muslim community, they have a more tendency towards a madrasa education rather than the state or the modern education that we are talking about, right? There are restrictions in terms of how they behave with non-believers, right? So this do impact the human rights of others, and also the person who's being converted.
You know, at this time in this country, there are many Jews, many Christians who do yoga, who do meditation, who believe in Hinduism. And I simply wanted to check with you, for example, how does it impact their human rights? Because human rights, if you look at them broadly, civil and political rights, and economic, social, and cultural rights, if those are the human rights that you are thinking about, because that is what you mentioned, then kindly give some thought to it. How are those impacted by conversion? For example, a Muslim who gets converted to Hinduism, or Hindu who gets converted to Muslim, how does it education? He wants to go to school, he wants to study in a university. How is it impacted? His health, he has got a government, here, for example, there is a person has got insurance, a person has got some Medicare, Medicaid. How does it get impacted if the person is converted? So I think we'll have to give a great deal of thought to it as to how these human rights, you're talking about cultural kind of setting and impact upon that. But let me hear from any of my colleagues if they have got any comments on it, because I think there'll have to be great deal of thoughtful deliberation on your part before you can, make, because conversion has got a trauma and a great deal of impact upon a human being. But in terms of this Western concept of human rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, civil and political rights, and simply saying that he's got to go to madrasa, he doesn't. Not every Muslim goes to madrasa. And Muslims also are there who go to universities, who do not go to madrasas, who do not believe in that. So if a person is converted to Islam and does not want to do that, he is still a Muslim. He is still converted. He has got no impact upon his economic, social, and cultural rights or civil and political rights. Maybe cultural rights, but I think the point simply would be that as you talked about Christians and how they converted all those people in Europe, here is a person, nobody anywhere can match what he has done, and that is Shekharji. He knows all that. And I think that impact in terms of human rights has been there. And he can talk much more about it and he can mention that to you. But I think otherwise, in today's setting, we'll have to think very carefully how to navigate that area.
So
Shekharji, why don't you say
yeah,
something, please?
yeah. So Ankitji, just to say exactly what Nandaji is saying, I liked one topic that you mentioned is a de-religionization, right? Uh, Especially in China, what is happening to the Muslim population, right? And it is
Yes.
being done by the state. So uh, I don't know what kind of camps they have or whatever it is. So that is one point I want to make. Maybe your research uh, would be in the current context of human rights would be appropriate for China and how Chinese government is treating its own citizens. That's number one. And number two was the number of items you have highlighted in various chapters that you would pursue. I thought it was a very exhaustive list. Even if you pick
Right.
one, that should be probably a lot, I would say. So that's my just initial reaction, I would say, but not a considered thought. But those two things came to my mind.
And Karlji, anything? Adityanjee, anything? Because
Well,
I think, uh, Shahji, what's going to happen is that as I look at it carefully, and then I can one on one talk with you and give you some ideas, and we can have some conversation
Yeah.
instead of all this in this setting. But I'll
sure.
be glad to assist you in terms of again very carefully, deliberately looking into it, because we need to see how much you can bite and it's that bite that's the one that's going to take. This is a pretty exhaustive, what
Yeah.
at the present time you have set. So we'll have to probably encompass only those areas that can be done in depth.
Yeah. So
I,
this list
I had a question.
come down and it has to become more granular in terms of what can be worked out.
Right.
I had a quick question, just based on Ankitji's presentation today. So, if countries like Saudi Arabia or Pakistan have not fully ratified uh, the Bill of Rights in all its aspects, then how is it that uh, just in 2020 Pakistan was re-elected to the UN Human Rights Council, and Saudi Arabia almost was, I believe, around the same time frame? On what basis are they even allowed to be nominated or nominate themselves for that position? I'm trying to understand how does that work?
I can assist you on that one. What really has happened is that the human rights issues in the United Nations are totally politicized. That is what had happened with the Human Rights Commission. That is why the commission was moved, changed to Human Rights Council. And these wonderful idealistic notions about human rights, they are not taken into account at all when you are looking at the countries that are elected. What has happened is that the election process is by regions. Regions are the ones that themselves say that out of this Eastern Europe, European countries, Middle East, African, American, North American, American countries, Asian countries. So they have got regions, and each region simply elects people, and there is no basis. There are no criteria. And you're absolutely right. It's violators of human rights who are the ones being accused by everyone of war crimes, even crimes against humanity, total oppressors, and they are elected to these human rights positions. So, very good question, but that is unfortunately the setting, and we need to recognize and realize that human rights is a political organization.
Right.
In the Security Council, when a country votes, it's not on any basis. Security Council, all these 5 permanent members, they don't have to give any reason. They simply say yay or nay. Once they have vetoed for any reason, no action can be taken. So that is the present setting on elections, Carlji.
Thank you, sir.
Adityanjee, any comments, please?
Before I make comments, I will invite our second fellow if he wants to say anything. His appointment letter was finalized just today. And
Is he on it?
yes, Mr.
I
Viputaman.
didn't know that. Well, that's great. Thank you.
And actually,
Thank you,
next week he'll
Adityanjee.
be making a presentation. But if you have just, on the spot, stray comments, observations, we don't want you to be excluded because this was not your presentation. Please feel free to participate. We know you are not prepared, but you were gracious enough to join this today because you did not want to be behind in the curriculum. So, any
And you
comments?
don't have to participate very fully about anything. If you have any comments, we are very
Yeah,
eager to hear,
yeah.
but they are not expected necessarily.
Thank you, Adityanjee and Nandaji, for this opportunity. I'm greatly honored. Um, Two things I just wanted to know. We spoke about um, state guy forced de-religionization or religionization. How about the um, basically some sort of order by the global corporates which are in different countries, and um, as part of their code of conduct, they implement something which basically compromises persons' human rights. For example, uh, you know, uh, like for example, take a example of COVID. uh, sending the employees in the region which are very risky, and employee doesn't want to go, but he has to go or she has to go because the employer is forcing them to do that. So this is one area. I think when we were basically talking about the state laws, we can also include like some governing organizations also, basically, so that we can expand this topic. Second, my point was, um, it's a question basically. So how the World Trade Organization includes human rights law, uh, its treaties. If someone can enlighten me on that topic, that would be nice.
We can talk about it in depth also. I teach the World Trade Organization, and unfortunately, the World Trade Organization does not take into account human rights. World Trade Organization, and we can talk much more about it in depth, but they don't. And about the corporations, you know probably better than I do, that the United Nations very early started talking about having some kind of not voluntary code of conduct, but some kind of rules and regulations. And the United Nations totally failed about it. It started in several ways. It had the elders, a group of elders that met, that had put together a code of conduct, and corporations, unfortunately, were not at the table. And so it went absolutely nowhere. The Human Rights Commission had a subcommission, and that subcommission talked about a code of conduct, put it together, it went absolutely nowhere. So today, what has happened is that there is a Professor Ruggie, and Human Rights Council is the one. The Secretary General asked him to work on it, and now there is a code of conduct. It's totally voluntary. You've got code of conduct that has got many settings. There is the um, you probably know that there are 3 or 4 voluntary codes of conduct, and today there is a set of principles that is protect, respect, and remedy. Protection is for the states, respect is for the corporations. And you probably have seen it, but I'll be sending all of you that setting in which the corporations are involved. So, corporations today are involved in it. They have got their own voluntary codes of conduct, but now states have been requiring, in some cases, as in India, you probably know that it's not corporate social responsibility simply under codes of conduct of a corporation, but the country says, corporation, you've got to give 1%, 2%. That is going to be your social responsibility. But we can talk much more about it. And I'll send you, I've got a big chapter that I did on corporate social responsibility and the corporation's role in human rights. Because today in the United Nations, and I serve on the American Bar Association's Center for Human Rights, and we've got a group of people that are working at the United Nations in Geneva, and it meets every year on business and human rights. And on business and human rights today, they are working on remedies as to how far corporations are responsible. Because at one time, as you know, it was simply corporations' responsibility to shareholders. Today, you've gone beyond that. You say there are stakeholders. These are not simply shareholders, but the community. There is at the present time not only community, but the state. So we can talk much more in depth about it. But a whole lot of work has been going on human rights and business and human rights and corporations. Adityanjee, kindly say
Thank you,
something.
sir.
because we are going to conclude in about 6 minutes.
We are going to conclude because we don't want to go beyond our allocated
No,
time.
8:30 will conclude my time. So we got 6 minutes, and Adityanjee, any comments from you? And then I do have a couple more things to say to Mr. Shah.
So, Ankit, it was a great presentation. You traced the historical antecedents and came to the present time. Then you touched upon your research proposal. And although it is a good kind of overview or review of some of the issues you are talking about conversion, when you talk about research proposal, you need to formulate a hypothesis. Hypothesis needs to be very specific and narrow, and hypothesis should be testable. Okay, and then you should, start gathering your evidence for or against the hypothesis. So that is involving scientific matters, approach into social sciences, and it's being done much more readily using an empirical approach. Uh, so you have still a lot of time to develop your own research proposal in consultation with Professor Nanda or any of the other faculty preceptors. You can talk to Professor Pathak, you can talk to Professor Lavanya Vemsani. Whole lot of resources are available to you, but have, just like Dr. Shekhar Patel said, that every idea you have put forth, that is in itself is a research topic. So have a very narrow, streamlined, specific topic for your research rather than talk about the overview. That's the only advice I'll give you, and I'll leave the floor to Professor Nanda, who has to make his final comments.
Well, thank you very much. And Shahji, you and I can talk one-on-one because there's no need right now to go into got several points for you, but we can chat again individually. So Adityanjee, I think we can close it. And Chauriji, welcome also. And we can continue talking about it. And I think I simply want to thank Mr. Clemens for putting it all together and for the WebEx to at least permit me to come back. I, I, I couldn't do anything. It just simply sent me back and said, you are a non-entity. And I said, I know that in this world today, I'm a visit, but still at least please let me in.
I
And
finished.
I said, I've got a human right to join them. I am the one to speak today. So I think after I said that, then you can probably see that human rights
It's
wins.
Carlo laughing today. I'm like, yeah, we got the booster. This is what we got.
I think I've got to go to Carl and talk with him because. All right. Well, thank you very, very much, everybody.
Thank
And
you.
Mr. Shah, welcome. Hearty welcome to you also, Mr. Pachauri. And it will be wonderful to have you with us.
Yesterday night was very, not the
Thank
night as such, but yesterday evening was very